We often confuse openness with authenticity. In a world that glorifies vulnerability and sharing, we've been led to believe that the more we tell people about ourselves, the more real we become. That if we lay our thoughts, fears, and past experiences out on the table for everyone to see, we are somehow living more honestly. But the truth is, trust doesn't work that way. Trust is not something we are entitled to just by speaking. It's something that is built over time, carefully and intentionally, with the right people. And that means not everyone gets access to everything. There is a subtle but crucial difference between being honest and being transparent. Honesty means speaking truthfully. Transparency means letting people see everything. One is a value, the other is a strategy. We can be honest without being fully transparent. We can answer questions truthfully without disclosing the depths of our lives to people who haven't earned that privilege. Trust is earned, not owed. It's not a favor you hand out freely just because someone showed interest. In fact, the most dangerous thing you can do in any relationship, whether professional, personal, or even casual, is to assume that interest equals care or that attention equals safety. People often mistake curiosity for concern. They assume that if someone wants to know something personal, they must have good intentions. But not everyone asking about your life wants to support it. Sometimes people ask to gain leverage. Sometimes they ask because they're bored. Sometimes they ask simply because they want to feel powerful, like they know something others don't. And when you give them that information too freely, you're not building connection, you're giving up control. Think about how we build trust in the real world. It doesn't happen in a single conversation. It happens in small moments. It builds through consistent actions, repeated behavior, and the feeling that someone sees you, supports you, and has proven over time that they have your best interests in mind. When you walk into a new job or enter a new circle of friends, you don't start by telling them everything about your life. You observe, you listen. You learn how people behave under stress. You watch how they treat others. You wait, and when someone consistently shows you that they are respectful, kind, discreet, and aligned with your values, you offer a little more, and then a little more. That's trust. That's how real relationships work. Oversharing shortcuts that entire process. It jumps straight to intimacy without earning it, and when intimacy is unearned, it feels awkward, even intrusive. You can see it happen in conversations. Someone reveals too much too soon, and suddenly the room gets quiet. The vibe shifts. People don't know what to do with the information, and the person who shared it ends up feeling either regretful or exposed. That's because what they gave wasn't received with the care it deserved. Not because the people were cruel, but because they weren't ready. Trust is a two-way street, and it's paced. You can't rush it just because you want connection quickly. It doesn't work that way. Another layer to this is protection. Not just emotional, but reputational. In many cases, how much you reveal can affect how others view your credibility, your decision making, even your leadership. When we disclose personal details without context or discernment, we open ourselves up to being misunderstood. People love to fill in gaps in stories. When you share a half-formed truth, they'll often invent the rest. And rarely does that invented narrative work in your favor. So the question becomes not just, can I trust this person with my story, but will they understand it the way it's meant to be understood? That's a different level of discernment. It takes maturity and self-awareness to recognize that not every person has the framework to carry your truth with care. We are told to be vulnerable, and vulnerability is indeed powerful, but only in the right context with the right people. Vulnerability without safety is not bravery, it's exposure. And exposure, when repeated too often, doesn't create closeness. It creates caution in others. People begin to wonder, why are they telling me this? What do they want from me? Are they looking for attention, affirmation, or something else? And the very connection you hoped to build starts to erode. Because connection isn't built through data, it's built through trust, through time, through mutual respect. When we guard ourselves carefully, we're not being cold or closed off. We're honoring the fact that trust is a process. We're saying, I value myself enough to be cautious with my story. I respect you enough to wait and see if you're the kind of person who holds other people's stories with care. That's not hiding, that's wisdom. And it's a powerful thing. We live in a world that celebrates visibility. Social media, podcasts, live streams. Everywhere we turn, there's a message that says, share more, be open, be raw, be real. And while that sounds empowering, it often blurs the line between connection and exposure. Somewhere along the way, we began to believe that oversharing is the same as being authentic. But there's something powerful about not saying everything, about holding something back, about knowing that mystery isn't deception, it's protection. And more than that, it's influence. Mystery builds respect. Oversharing invites assumptions. When we hold a little bit back, people lean in. It creates curiosity. It invites people to observe instead of judge. Because the truth is, people can only understand you through the lens of their own experience. The more you give them, the more room you give for misunderstanding. The more content you put out into the world, whether in a conversation or online, the more people feel like they have a right to an opinion about you. They don't just interpret your words, they add meaning, intention, even motive. Suddenly, something you said in a vulnerable moment becomes a point of speculation. Something you shared in passing becomes your entire identity in their mind. The more you show, the more they assume. There's a strange paradox here. People think that being open earns them connection, but what it often earns is judgment, and not always because people are cruel or malicious. Sometimes they're just not capable of holding what you share with the weight it deserves. They haven't walked your path. They don't understand the complexity. But when you present yourself fully to them too soon, they believe they do. They form opinions, they label, they reduce. And without even realizing it, you go from being a person to being a category in someone's mental filing system. That's the cost of oversharing. You lose the nuance. You lose the benefit of the doubt. You lose the power of context. Mystery, on the other hand, gives you space. When you don't tell people everything, they have to sit with questions. They observe more closely. They listen more intently. They begin to form respect, not because you proved yourself to them, but because you didn't feel the need to. There's an unspoken confidence in being selective about what you reveal. It signals that you know your own value, that you're not trying to convince anyone to understand you. You're simply living in a way that lets the right people earn access, and the rest remain at a healthy distance. In leadership, this is especially important. The leaders who maintain a sense of mystery, who don't constantly explain every move or expose every emotion, are often the ones who command the most respect. It's not because they're hiding anything. It's because they understand that their influence comes not from how much they share, but from how intentionally they choose to share it. People follow those who appear composed, thoughtful, and in control. Oversharing can give the impression of instability, even if the intention was connection. And once that perception takes hold, it's hard to reverse. In personal relationships, it's much the same. The people we're most drawn to aren't usually the ones who lay everything on the table from the first moment. They're the ones who reveal themselves slowly, over time, with care. Not because they're guarded, but because they understand the power of pacing. They recognize that intimacy, when rushed, often collapses, that when everything is known too soon, there's no room for discovery, and discovery is what makes relationships exciting, real, and sustainable. It's in the uncovering, the slow learning, the gradual trust building that depth is created. And let's be honest, most people are uncomfortable with too much honesty. They may say they want it, but they don't know how to handle it. When someone shares something deeply personal, it can create an invisible burden in the listener. They might feel obligated to respond in a certain way, to share something in return, or to act as a confidant when they never signed up for that role. It changes the dynamic. It shifts the balance, and more often than not, it makes people pull back instead of lean in. That's not connection. That's disconnection masked as vulnerability. There's a reason the most magnetic people often say the least. They leave space for interpretation. They don't rush to fill silence with details. They're not evasive. They're just intentional, and that intentionality creates presence. People pay more attention. They feel like they're in the presence of someone who values their own story enough to protect it. And that energy is rare. It stands out. It lingers. Because in a world where everyone is shouting their truths, the person who speaks with precision and restraint becomes unforgettable. Oversharing, at its core, is often an attempt to control how we're perceived. We think that if we explain ourselves enough, if we lay it all out, people will finally get it. But perception doesn't work that way. People don't see you for what you reveal. They see you through the lens of what they already believe. And if they're not ready to hear your truth, no amount of explaining will make them understand. That's why mystery matters. It gives you the space to be seen gradually, the way trust and connection are meant to grow, slowly, intentionally, and with meaning. Not every chapter of your story is meant to be read aloud, and certainly not all at once. We often feel pressure to be fully known, completely understood, and entirely transparent with people we encounter, whether in friendships, relationships, or professional environments. The pressure is subtle but constant. It comes from cultural messages that tell us sharing is healing, or that vulnerability is the currency of authenticity. And while there's truth in the idea that being known can be powerful, it's not the same thing as being wise. Some chapters of your life are still being written and others have already been closed, but that doesn't mean everyone gets access to them. Sharing your story requires timing, context, and trust. Without those, what was meant to be sacred becomes just another piece of noise in someone else's mind. We've all been in situations where we revealed too much too soon. Maybe it was on a first date, a new friendship, or an initial meeting with a colleague. And maybe, for a moment, it felt good, liberating even, like you were shedding the weight of secrecy, but then came the discomfort, the silence, the misunderstanding, the shift in how they looked at you. And suddenly, something that felt like connection turned into something else: exposure, judgment, or just awkward distance. That's because every story has a place, and not every listener is prepared or equipped to hold it. A chapter read out of order can confuse the plot, not deepen the meaning. Some people are still working on understanding their own story, let alone capable of understanding yours. And yet we hand them the manuscript, hoping they'll read it with compassion, with care, with curiosity. But often they don't. They skip lines, they highlight the wrong parts, they talk about what they think it means instead of asking us what it meant to live it. That's not always their fault. It's human nature. We interpret what we're told through the lens of our own experience. But that's exactly why not everyone gets the full story. Because once it's in their hands, you no longer control how it's read, quoted, or retold. Think of your life like a book. You wouldn't give someone random pages torn from the middle and expect them to understand the arc of the story. They'd miss the context, the motivations, the turning points that explain why a particular moment mattered. The same is true for your personal history. Some people only see you in the moment they meet you, and that's the only lens they'll ever use. If you reveal something deep, some trauma, a loss, a past mistake, they may attach it to your identity, not realizing it's just one part of a larger narrative. They may make it the headline of who you are, when in reality, it was just a footnote, a lesson, or a scar that doesn't define you. Timing plays a critical role here. Just because something happened years ago doesn't mean you're ready to talk about it today. And just because you've processed it on your own doesn't mean others are ready to hear it the way you intend. Some stories require stability in the relationship before they are shared. They require a foundation of trust, of empathy, of consistency. You don't plant seeds in hard soil and expect growth. The same is true with personal truth. If the environment isn't ready, the story won't take root. It may be met with indifference or worse, with careless judgment that leaves you feeling more alone than before. There's also something deeply human about protecting the sacredness of your story. It's not about being secretive. It's about knowing your story is not a transaction. It's not something to be exchanged for validation, attention, or temporary connection. When you treat it like a gift instead of a currency, you become far more selective with who you give it to, and that's a sign of self-respect. It means you understand the power of your experiences, and you don't need constant retelling to affirm their value. It's important to realize that even when you share parts of yourself with someone, they still don't fully know you. They see a window, not the whole landscape, and sometimes that's all they need. Not everyone is meant to read the whole book. Some people are only here for a chapter. Some aren't ready for the complexity, the depth, or the truth of your experience. That doesn't mean you're hiding anything. It just means you're not offering every detail to people who haven't earned that level of trust. People who truly care about you won't demand access to every part of your past. They'll be patient with what you offer. They'll understand that what's not said is just as important as what is, and they'll make space, not pressure, for the story to unfold. That's the difference between someone who wants to know you and someone who wants to understand you. The former is driven by curiosity, the latter is grounded in care. You don't owe your story to every curious person. Curiosity doesn't qualify someone to be a keeper of your truth. There's wisdom in allowing people to read your life slowly, to offer glimpses instead of full reveals, to give context over time. When we rush to tell it all, we strip our story of its natural rhythm. We deny ourselves the opportunity to be known deeply and patiently, and we forget that intimacy at its best is not immediate. It is earned, chapter by chapter, over time. When you choose to reveal something about yourself, your thoughts, your struggles, your past, you are not just sharing information. You are shaping how people perceive you. Every detail you offer becomes a part of a larger narrative that others begin to construct in their minds. But the moment you hand over that information, you also hand over control of the story. People will draw their own conclusions, filter your words through their own biases, and sometimes build an image of you that has little to do with who you actually are. That's why it's not just about what you say, it's about what you choose to say, when, and to whom. If you don't control the narrative will control you. We often underestimate how quickly people make assumptions. The smallest detail can change the entire trajectory of how someone sees you. A passing comment, a vulnerable admission, or a story from your past can anchor itself in someone's memory and become the centerpiece of how they define you. You may have shared it to illustrate growth or self-awareness, but if the listener is not aligned with that intention, they might focus only on the flaw, the failure, or the mistake. And once someone locks onto a specific version of you, it's extremely difficult to shift that perception. It becomes their reference point. Every new interaction is filtered through it. This is especially true in environments where power, influence, or reputation matters. In the workplace, for example, revealing too much about your insecurities or personal struggles can alter how your competence is perceived. Even if you're high-performing and reliable, the moment someone sees you as emotionally unstable or overly self-focused, they might begin to second-guess your leadership, your judgment, or your ability to handle pressure. Not because they're malicious, because people are wired to make snap judgments and to protect their own sense of security. When you share something personal, you're giving them something to react to, and their reaction might be rooted more in their own limitations than in your reality. There's a certain safety in being misunderstood when you're quiet. When people don't know much about you, they can only speculate, and speculation leaves room for possibility. But once you fill in the blanks for them, once you give them the data, they begin to define you with it. And in doing so, they may limit you, box you in, or relate to you in a way that's no longer accurate. That's the risk of uncontrolled narrative. What you say today may become the only thing they remember about you tomorrow. That one story you told to connect may become the label they place on you for years. You see it all the time, people explaining themselves, defending their choices, or offering backstories that no one asked for, simply because they're trying to be real. But the more you try to shape how others see you through excessive disclosure, the more power you give away. You can't explain your way into being understood. You can only live consistently and let your actions reinforce who you are. When you speak less and live more intentionally, you start to reclaim that control. You start to craft a narrative not with words, but with presence, with discipline, with integrity, and when you do speak, when you do decide to share, you do it with purpose. You choose the parts of your story that align with your direction, not just your history. You don't tell stories to relieve emotional pressure, but to create strategic understanding. That doesn't mean being manipulative. It means being deliberate, being aware that every word adds weight to the version of you that people carry in their minds. The most effective communicators know this. They understand that every time they open their mouth, they are either reinforcing a story or rewriting it. And so they speak with clarity, not chaos, with foresight, not impulse. There's also a dignity in silence. Not everything needs to be addressed. Not every criticism needs a response. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. When you try to manage everyone's perception, you dilute your message. You begin to appear unsure of who you are. Ironically, it's the person who can stand in the face of misinterpretation without rushing to explain that often commands the most respect. People sense that they're dealing with someone who's grounded, someone who isn't easily shaken by public opinion or social pressure. And that kind of presence doesn't just influence others, it inspires them. Controlling the narrative doesn't mean being cold or closed off. It means recognizing that your story is powerful and that power deserves to be directed, not dispersed. When you share too much, you lose the ability to shape how people understand you. You flood the space with so many details that the core message gets lost. But when you curate your story, when you decide which moments matter and why, you create a stronger impact. You stay in control. You remain the author rather than letting others become editors of your identity